All right, so new in Cinema 4D 2025.3 is liquids or fluids, however you want to call it. It's the newest and probably last kind of part of Cinema 4D's new simulation tools, and we'll talk about how we can work with them, a couple of different project examples, as well as talk about their limitations. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so let's dive in here and get started talking about creating liquids in Cinema 4D. The good news is it's really an extension of Cinema 4D's kind of existing, though relatively new, particle system. So if you are familiar with this, it should be relatively straightforward in terms of how you create and work with your emitters. So we do have a new one for filling liquids or filling something with a liquid specifically, and it's really this liquefy modifier that kind of turns everything into liquid. So what's great about it being part of the main particle system here is it works with all of Cinema 4D's other simulation tools, smoke, fire, rigid body, soft body, cloth. Let's create a basic emitter here. Now I've already created a null that has some back and forth animation and just moves across this. So we can create like a basic enrobing animation where the chocolate gets kind of moved all around and draped over the candy bar. And so if you just hit play, you'll see our particle system. Well, they're behaving just like particles. There's no gravity or other forces or anything else applied to them. And like I mentioned, that's really because we need to add the liquefy modifier. And what this does is apply gravity and gets our particles to behave more fluid-like. Now, at the moment, they don't have anything to interact with. And so I'll take my three pieces of geometry, kind of the caramel, the cookie part of the candy bar, as well as the floor that's hidden. And I'm going to add a collider tag, just like you would for any of Cinema 4D's other simulation tools. And now we can see that we're getting some very different behavior with these particles. They have gravity applied. They're kind of clumping, sticking together a bit as they, move around. And the good news is, like I mentioned, if you're familiar with these particle systems, all these same things kind of apply and work in terms of, what emission shape we're using, how the particles are being emitted. I'm going to increase this quite a bit. Maybe we'll do something like 13,000, or at least try. And you can see we can emit quite a few particles here. And yeah, we get some really nice looking groups of particles, which is great. Now, I skipped over it, but I do want to point out in our collider tag here, we do now have a new section that is specific for liquids. And so how our geometry is going to how we want it to work with collision. So whether you want the surface or the volume of it to be calculated and used, what side of the geometry you want it to use, outside or inside. In this case, we do want it on the outside. Maybe if we were trying to fill something and we only had a single polygon, then you would do inside. And you can also work with voxelation settings here to help with kind of the scale and quality, since that is what is eventually used to create the geometry. It is voxels and kind of the same type of thing you have here in your volume builder. I find relative to be more than adequate, but if you do like working with specific sizes, this can be useful as well. And yeah, that's all looking pretty good. Now in our liquefy, this is where we can adjust these settings to control how the liquid looks and how it behaves. We do have the mode here set to liquefy, and that is what is making these particles look like liquid. You can take the liquid contribution to 0, and then they once again just behave kind of like your normal Cinema 4D particles without any of the forces or liquid fanciness applied. And so I'll come back to this because that's all something else we see a bit later. And we also have a default radius. Now this default radius is located in your scene settings. I'll make sure to point that out here in a bit, but the default radius is actually 3 centimeters, so quite large. And because of that, you don't want to work in a realistic scale, right? So here's this, normal Cinema 4D cube. You can see that my candy bar is, several cubes in length here, and this cube itself is 200 centimeters. So I'm working larger is apparently better, which is unfortunate, but, is what it is, at least for the time being. And then we have the specific controls for liquid, which determines how it looks, how the liquid's going to behave, how thick or thin it is. And this is where you will spend a lot of time. This and really one or two other places in determining, the type of liquid you're creating. So the density can help with, if you're working with multiple liquids or trying to make something kind of float or be buoyant. Viscosity and surface tension are some of the main factors here in terms of changing the way the liquid looks, whether you want it to be thicker, whether you want it to stick more together. That's what those two do. We have our mixture ID, which can be useful for when you're combining and working with multiple liquids, as well as this ease in property, which is how many frames before the liquid mode gets applied here. So what ends up happening is there's 5 frames where all of our particles act like regular particles, and then they start to behave like liquid after 5 frames. And this can be helpful because if you do have any kind of intersecting or kind of popping or exploding particles that are coming from your emitter, and just to kind of show that, if I increase this to 33, hopefully that's not too many, we'll see some kind of like explosion out the back there. And that's because all these particles just can't fit out of my emitter at once. And so increasing that ease in value can help get rid of that, right? So that can be very helpful there. I will just set this back to 13,000, but you can see we can, throw quite a few particles, right, in a simulation, and have it play back at a relatively reasonable speed. Now, that will be dependent on your computer and how powerful it is. I have a 5080 for reference, so if yours is working significantly better or slower, that could be part of it. It could also be, the drivers in Cinema 4D, what version you're using. Okay, I suspect, over time we will see performance improve a bit, whether it's through software updates in Cinema 4D or driver updates with the graphics cards. So yeah, here's what we have right now. And we also have different properties for how our particles behave when interacting with our geometry, very similar to what we have in the collider tag itself. So, you can have one set of properties for your particles and different sets of properties for your geometry, because, if you're trying to have liquid emitted over different surfaces, they may respond differently. So they can have different friction, bounciness, stickiness settings, and you can have some kind of global options for that here. Now, the other place you can work with the quality and settings for your particle system is in scene settings, simulation, and liquids. It's a bit strange place that actually isn't too strange since most of these deal with quality, though from what I've seen, you are actually better off working more with the viscosity and surface iterations here as opposed to doing that in the liquefy. Okay, not that you can't get some good results with that, but you seem to get higher quality results when you increase the iterations. And since that's kind of what's most important, is to end up with a higher quality result, working with the iterations tends to give better results. And the passes and extra iterations here too can work with the quality. So that radius being so large, it is something you can turn down. I have found you do want to be a bit careful with that, especially if you're working with like a liquid fill emitter, because it will emit more particles. And Cinema 4D does have a limit to what it can work with here. But for instance, if we turn up our viscosity iterations to say 10, we should start to see this behave like a much thicker liquid. And so it's coming out a bit slower, it's draping a bit slower. It's not separating as much because it's thicker, right? And we could even go a bit higher. Maybe we do 50 just to see what more of the extreme look of this is. And so this is how you can create those thicker fluids like chocolate, syrup, toothpaste. And that's really what Cinema 4D's particle system is best at right now. It's has a hard time trying to create thin liquids, really due to, I guess, the way they're solving for it, in addition to just the number of particles and things like that we're able to work with, all right? So can see how that looks. Just to see what the opposite looks, let's see what surface tension looks like. And once again, you would get similar results from increasing the properties in the liquefy, okay? But you end up with something that behaves a little bit more predictable, I have found, when you work with the iterations here. So this is looking interesting. And when you combine these two together, that's really where you get something that's really kind of thick, right? And while we could go higher here, let's just see what happens when we change those same settings in the liquify, right? So it's been difficult to figure out if you want to use the same range or smaller values, but notice how it just kind of shoots out a little bit more. It's flowing. I have something that's a bit closer to toothpaste, this using the actual properties. All right, and so that can be nice, and you can see just how much it's sticking together and how it really isn't kind of flowing over the chocolate bar here. So, really, I have found adjusting these settings ever so slightly, and then using the scene settings to do the heavy lifting to be what gives you the best result. I also want to point out that, if we were trying to create chocolate here that's, flowing over everything, we could also work with those collider tag properties or even the properties in the liquify. Okay. So if we increase the stickiness here, let's just go. So I don't think we need that high. And I do find it a bit odd that, the settings have just such a different range here, right? So I suppose you can go higher, but the fact that this kind of maxes out at 1, can really throw you for a loop. All right, because it's hard to tell if these are the same values you should be using in the liquify, or if you should be using much higher ones. But hopefully that's something that gets cleared up over time. So we have something now that's kind of working pretty well. It may actually be a bit too thick or not kind of going over enough. So why don't we try turning this down? And once again, it's a back and forth. It's adjusting these different values. Now, one thing we haven't done quite yet is try to create geometry from this, because right now what we have is a particle system. And so if we want to create geometry, what we need to use is the liquid mesh. So when you add that, it's going to be applied to all particle groups unless you do otherwise. And this really is the final kind of touch on your liquid and can determine how thick or thin it is. So the particle radius certainly plays a role in that. But here is where you can decide really how thick you want this to be. Now, at the moment, we're not actually seeing geometry. We're kind of seeing the volume voxel kind of look of this. You can see, we're still breaking apart just a bit. Not the end of the world. Okay. And what's nice about the liquid mesh, and while it does slow down playing, at any point, you can toggle it off or on while you're playing back your particle sim. So if you wanted to take a look at it at a specific frame, play through to that frame, you can then turn it on or off, and you will get that slightly better playback speed. So I'm going to let this go a little bit, and in fact, I may actually turn down some of my settings just to make it a little bit easier to kind of see what these do. So let's simulate this one more time. Right. That's looking pretty good. So I'll turn on my liquid mesh. And so we have our influence scale here. Really kind of works with the radius to determine how thick our liquid should be, how close the particles are going to look to kind of combine with the neighboring particle. All right. So a lower value will give you a thinner looking liquid. Same with surface offset, right? Can make for a thinner looking liquid, almost like you're extruding out by whatever the value it is here. Now, once again, since we are working with voxels, you can work with the relative number of steps or the absolute voxel size here. I find the steps to be a little bit easier to work with, but if you prefer the absolute values, go for it. And at the moment, we don't have geometry. And in order to export geometry, so render this, you would need to also turn geometry on. And you can see everything's really faceted because we don't have our normals turned on, and that smooths things quite a bit. And now you can come in here, and if you turn on your lines, you can see that we have quite a bit of geometry, and turning up the steps will add more geometry, which allows you to get more detail. Now you want to be a bit careful with that because you can end up with a lot of geometry and something that makes it really hard for Cinema 4D to work with. So just something to be careful of. And we also have smoothing. So right now you can see we have, still looks relatively low poly overall. You can increase the smoothing iterations and that will smooth it out and give you a little bit more of a nice, thinner liquid shape, usually at the expense of creating a more solid looking liquid. And so while this looks pretty good, right? If you were trying to create, a thin liquid like water, it's hard to judge just from, this playback, right? Because it's not very fast. And so that's something you need to be a bit careful of, is trying to make judgments on your simulation just from this playback, because this is not playing back very fast. Caching this out can help with that. Doing a preview render after absolutely helps. You can smooth the normals as well as a way to smooth things out a little bit more. I haven't found this does a whole lot, but can be useful. And although you get some weird issues with it too much. Processing, I found, really doesn't do a whole lot. And in fact, if you're working with a very complex simulation, can crash Cinema 4D. And while I would expect maybe it to remove some weird issues, weird looking droplets, things like that, it doesn't seem to do that. We do have some droplet control here if you want to, break things up a little bit and determine how big or large your droplet should be. Okay. And that's really about it for the liquid mesh. The last thing would be just to mention that, in order to cache this, you want to come to the particle group, go to cache, and then, cache it out. And that can certainly help things play back smoother and give you a better idea of, what your end result is going to look like, because it just isn't very easy to play this back and make a lot of judgments here. So I do have one that I spent a little bit more time on. And so this is also cached, which is why it's playing back so smoothly. And you can see we end up with some decent looking results, especially when you turn on, the mesher, right? And even when it's meshed, okay, it looks pretty good. Now, there is still quite a bit of kind of, popping or a little bit of vibrating to the particle, in addition to maybe some particles we don't want. So it's by no means perfect, but just as a quick kind of overall look, to give you an idea of what it's capable of, this isn't too bad. And, for the particle settings, right, starts at around 13,000 and then it dies off. For the liquefy settings, I increased the friction and stickiness here, constraints. Didn't make a whole lot of change there, but where I did make changes was, once again, where I was talking about earlier in the liquid section of the simulation setting. So I increased the extra iterations as well as the viscosity and surface tension iterations. And so that's what gives us this result. And I have the floor hidden here, which is why it kind of droops over. And I really think that's an interesting look. Now, once again, it's the simulation, it's the particles that are cached itself. So I could come in here and maybe work a little bit more with my mesh. And in theory, if we were to increase the geometry smoothness iterations, okay, maybe, just maybe, you could get a little bit of that popping less. The problem is, since I did change the liquid mesh, right, it's having to do a lot more calculations and therefore not playing back. And you can see we got rid of a lot of that, kind of popping, moving, vibrating type look. Now, I think we got rid of a lot of the detail. So I would dial this back until I found something that, worked pretty well. Was kind of a compromise. But yeah, that's kind of what you can end up with. Okay. So that's a quick look at kind of working with Cinema 4D's liquids with a regular emitter. What we're going to do now is take a look at working with a liquid fill emitter. Cool. Now, you want to fill something up, the easiest way by far is to use a liquid fill emitter, although I'm not going to use it the way you might expect. This is just a glass from the asset browser that I did scale up, right? Notice it is about the size of a regular cube in Cinema 4D. And when you think about the default radius of a particle being 3 centimeters, well, this is, oops, if I can select the cube here to show you, about how big it is, or at least would be if I got it on all three. So that's actually, relatively small. So that's what you want to think about when trying to create liquids, is that default particle radius. Now, like I've said, you do want to be careful, because if you make that too small, things can get weird, things can crash, and that's never a fun time. So what I'm going to do is just make this sphere about the size of the opening here of our cup. I'm going to move it up and make it longer. All right. I'm trying to essentially kind of think of and make the volume that I want my particles to fill and then drop into the cup. So I'm not filling the cup with the cup. I'm filling it with the sphere. And then I'm going to drop these into there. And so if you have that sphere selected and come over here to your emitters and choose liquid fill, that's exactly what it's going to do. It's going to use whatever geometry you had selected, and it's going to fill it in a sphere packing kind of method, which works out great. You can change the resolution. Okay. If you want, I would recommend just kind of leaving this as is. And then we have kind of some basic particle emission properties here. Okay, so nothing too crazy. And so now when I hit play, you'll see we get particles. They do already have the liquefy property or modifier applied. That is one of the differences between this and say your basic emitter. And so great, we're off to a nice start here. What I need to do though is on the glass, add a collider tag. So that way the particles interact, and I'll turn off the sphere so we can see it. And you can see relatively quickly, we're able to fill a glass and create something that looks pretty good. And this is one of the things I've had a really hard time with particle systems in the past, is just filling an object. And I found using a liquid fill emitter like this is actually better or works quicker than, say, using a basic emitter, just in terms of trying to fill something up. So I did create a plane here. Let's add a collider tag to it and just hide it so that our particles don't fall forever. And while it may look like I have too many particles, because I guess I do, if all I was trying to do is fill this, I do want to keep this for now because things can change. Okay. Now, the way it works is it's filling up this sphere with as many particles as it can based on the radius in our scene settings. And so you can either lower the particle radius or make your sphere larger to create more particles. Now, one of the things I like to do here is change the density distribution, because without it, when I hit play, notice we get a very even, regular grid of particles. And that just doesn't make for a very realistic, look and simulation. So I like to switch the distribution to noise, and then you have other options that you can play with. But now, if I pause it, you can see we have slightly more irregular distribution of particles. We also end up with fewer particles, and so while it was overflowing before, it may not be doing that anymore. And I wish I could say I planned that, but kind of got lucky there. And yeah, you can see just after a few seconds, we have a filled glass here. And what I may want to do is just scale the sphere up a bit to have more. Right? And when you think about this, it feels like, at least with the values we currently have to work with, you have to almost use like double the volume in order to fill up an object here, which isn't terrible, I guess. But, at least in terms of trying to work through stuff and have it be as logical as possible, I would think you would want it to be as close to 1-to-1 as you can. Now, particle size can play into that as well as other things. And so it may be just the way it is, but I think in a perfect world, that would be great. So almost there, just trying to get it to overflow just a little bit more so that we can get some interesting looking splashing going on. And as I mentioned in the first part, we don't have a great way of doing kind of like a crown splash, of creating some really nice splashing effects. And what's nice is while we don't have a great way of doing it just kind of straight away, we can still use all of the forces from our other particle systems or that we had previously. So you can add a turbulence, and I will eventually do that, to help create something a little bit more interesting. This isn't too bad, although I liked what I had before, right? And keep in mind, we're just looking at the particle system here. So let's add a liquid mesh into this because this is also going to be important. You can see we got quite a bit of intersecting. We got these blobs here, and that's where surface offset can certainly help, right? Turning that down helps. And our influence scale, right, can also help in terms of, creating more interesting looking things. Now we have probably a few too many droplets than I would like to see. Maybe we increase our geometry iterations a bit to help kind of get rid of some of those. Maybe even increase the steps to 3. And so now we have something that at least on the ground looks pretty good in the cup here. We still have, some issues with that. And, there are a number of different places you could go to fix this. So maybe just extra iterations will work. Maybe making the particle radius smaller would work. Definitely a few different things you can do to try and overcome that and get rid of those. But yeah, I think, why don't we stop it like right here and see that we have something that, looks okay. Still perhaps a bit thick, at least as is. And so there's still some limitations here, like I was saying before, but the liquid fill, great for, creating some liquids. And this is really where I think, it doesn't look too bad, right? But perhaps where we could start working with the turbulence a little bit. And I wish I had confirmed what frame we get the splash on, because that's when I want to have the turbulent strength come up. All right, so at about 65 or so. I can't remember exactly where I want the turbulent strength, so let's just say 100 and see what we get. May get something a bit too crazy, but if you were trying to add a little bit of irregularity, this can certainly be one way to do it. I don't think we're getting a lot of it. I wonder if it's the scale. So once again, a little bit of back and forth. I feel like I'm seeing something now, so much so we're getting some overflowing, which isn't the end of the world, I suppose. But now we have definitely a more interesting, looking splash. And while our liquid still leaves quite a bit to be desired, maybe we do have to come in here to the influence scale and work with that. Surface offset perhaps as well, as much as I don't want to. And, just kind of play around a bit more. So keep in mind, while we do still have some limitations, sometimes they can be overcome, especially when you work with, some of these other forces. And if I didn't like some of the splashing, you can also use something like a destructor to delete particles, right? So I could move this, right here, make sure it's not in the cup, but in theory, anything that goes inside there, let's turn off the liquid mesh, will allow us to delete particles. You can see they're not kind of going through there. Now, that's a bit of a weird kind of effect, and probably would want to place this a little bit higher. But it just goes to show you just how easy it is to kind of work with and customize this effect. At any point I could move this out of the way, and then the rest of it would drop down. And once again, it can be hard to judge the way a fluid looks played back at whatever frames per second this is. And if you want to see exactly what frames per second that is, you can go to the configure menu, then go to HUD, turn on frames per second, and we can see just how fast or slow we're working here. We're at 7 frames per second, which is significantly slower than 30 frames. And so our animation is going to look very different when we do cache it and render it or just play it back. But yeah, that's kind of it for working with the liquid fill emitter. Pretty much the same, okay, in terms of what we saw with the previous one, except it has that built-in liquefy. So that will do it here. If there's anything else you would like to see, please leave me a comment down below. And if you found the video helpful, I'd appreciate it if you could like it and subscribe to my channel. Until next time, take care.